I can't remember the year. I think it might have been 2013. Basically, what happened is I think it was Dan Bailey and Scott Panchik had just finished doing a burpee snatch workout. And Rory and I were, kind of standing around. And he looks at me and he said, "Hey, do you just want to knock this out now?" The equipment was still out on the floor. And there were some people that kind of gathered around. There were a couple guys having some beers and they were heckling us and just kind of getting into it. And so we're like, "Hey, why don't we do this every time?" So when the show finishes, we're just going to make a gentleman's agreement that we're going to do it together afterwards and just knock it out. And so we did. And it wasn't really like a thing. That was just kind of our tradition. And then I can't remember when it was. It was a year or two later where one of the guys who was running the broadcast, he's like, "Hey, we're just going to keep the cameras rolling." So we said, "What do you mean? Who would want to watch us work out?" And so that was it. That was the birth of it. And then, it got more involved as we went there. They got commentators and it became a thing and we started to promote it a little bit. So yeah, it was just one of those things that started out really small and turns out people enjoyed it. So we kept doing it.
Welcome to the Best Hour of Your Day podcast. This is your host, Felix. And in this podcast, I am interviewing CrossFitters and experts from around the world. Today I have Adrian Bozman on the show. Adrian is better known as Boz and he's been head judge of the CrossFit Games for over a decade now. He just recently stepped into the footsteps of Dave Castro as he programmed the CrossFit Games of 2022 and also the Open of 2023. And we talk about programming the CrossFit Games, programming in a regular CrossFit box. We also talk about movement standards and points of performance. And he shares some of his wisdom and knowledge with his more than 15 years of CrossFit HQ experience. So stay tuned and have fun with this episode with Adrian Bozman. Welcome back to the podcast. Should I call you Adrian or just Boz?
Up to you. It's completely your choice. I'm good either way.
Okay. I think a lot of people know you by the name of Boz. And so I want to stick to it.
That works for me.
Actually, when I think of the first memories I have with CrossFit, there are some of those iconic CrossFit Open workouts where you went head to head with Rory McKernan.
Oh, yeah.
And that was some of the most iconic things I remember when I think about the last 10 years of CrossFit.
Oh, that's awesome. That makes me happy. I mean, those were such good times. Rory and I had a real blast doing that. It was simultaneously some of the most fun and most nerve-wracking times of the year. It was a lot to get up in front of people after they'd seen some of these superstars actually take it to the workouts in a way that is beyond most of us. And then to have us kind of follow up, it was, like I said, it was nerve wracking, but it was a lot of fun. Yeah.
When did it all start?
I can't remember the year. I think it might've been 2013. It was, I think the second year that we started doing the announcements. Oh man, my memory's not great, but, basically what happened is I think it was Dan Bailey and Scott Panchik had just finished doing a burpee snatch workout and the show had finished and Rory and I were, kind of standing around. The crew was striking a lot of the kind of the stage show. And he looks at me and he said, "Hey, do you just want to knock this out now, get it over with?" Because at the time, we were traveling back to back to back. It kind of gets tough to fit in the workouts. And so I'm like, "Yeah, let's do it." So we just lined it up and went for it. The equipment was still out on the floor. And there were some people that kind of gathered around. There were a couple guys having some beers and they were heckling us and just kind of getting into it. And so we're like, "Hey, why don't we do this every time?" So when the show finishes, we're just going to make a gentleman's agreement that we're going to do it together afterwards and just knock it out. And so we did. And it wasn't really like a thing. And that was just kind of our tradition. And then I can't remember when it was. It was a year or two later where one of the guys who was running the broadcast, he's like, "Hey, we're just going to keep the cameras rolling." So we said, "What do you mean? Who would want to watch us work out?" And so that was it. That was the birth of it. And then, it got more involved as we went there. They got commentators and it became a thing and we started to promote it a little bit. So yeah, it was just one of those things that started out really small. And it turns out people enjoyed it. So we kept doing it. Yeah, it was fun.
And you had your own merch. I had a shirt.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, there's a few of those that I still see from time to time. Yeah, it's cool.
Yeah, it's good old
Yep.
days.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think a lot of people know you because you're like one of the CrossFit OGs. Lately, there have been so many new people exposed to CrossFit.
Yeah.
I see it all the time. People are joining the CrossFit boxes and they don't really know about the history of the CrossFit Games and everything that involves with it. And for the people who don't know who you are, you want to like tell them like 1 or 2 minutes what your roles and responsibilities were back in the days and maybe how it changed till
Yeah,
now.
absolutely. And, it's kind of funny you talk about me as being one of the OGs. And I guess in a sense that's true. I don't consider myself that because there are certainly people that came before me. And, like I think I'm kind of more second wave if you want to get really nitty gritty about it. But yeah, I guess I have been lucky enough to be around a long time now. So in the early 2000s, I was living in San Francisco, California, and I stumbled across the CrossFit website. And at the time, it was really early. It was probably 2004. And CrossFit was really small. It was one gym in Santa Cruz. There were a couple of what they were calling affiliates at the time. It was a pretty loose term. But that was it. It really wasn't a big thing like it is today. And the hub was CrossFit.com, just the website. And they were unique in the sense that they would post a workout every day. That's what they were doing in the gym. And they just put it up there for free for people to find. And then they also started posting, little video clips of the workouts and video clips of the techniques that they were using. And, there was a time in the early yesteryears of the internet where CrossFit.com was the collection point for the biggest library of movement demos on the internet. And I don't know that that's true anymore because the internet is so big now. But back then it was certainly true. Anyway, so I got interested in CrossFit, started dabbling with it on my own a little bit. And by 2005, I was, pretty hooked, and I would go down to Santa Cruz once in a while and just take a class with the early trainers there. I met Greg Glassman, I met Annie Sakamoto, I met Eva T, I met all the early, Greg Amundsen, Nicole Carroll. And I was personal training at the time at just a regular gym and got more and more into it. So by 2006, I'd taken my level 1. I'd connected with Kelly Starrett and started coaching at San Francisco CrossFit. And by 2007, I was helping out with the seminars that CrossFit started to conduct on a more regular basis. They were starting to expand their staff. And so started helping with that. And one day they said, "Hey, we're going to pay you to show up." I said, What do you mean? I'd be doing it anyway, So all of a sudden, I've got a job with CrossFit in 2007. And then by 2008, I was working pretty full time on the road. That was when the seminars really started to take off and the team started to really get bigger. And so that was the same year in 2008 that I worked the games for the first time. And by the end of that first event, Dave Castro was calling me his head judge, and it just kind of grew from there. So over the years, I've done a lot of different things for CrossFit. My primary job was seminar instructor. I developed a lot of staff for that. It was another big part of my job was staff development. I had the opportunity to live in Australia for a time to develop the staff there. I'd spent some extended time in Europe conducting internal workshops for our staff there. Had a lot of hand in refining our staff materials and our instructor materials for the level 1 and other courses. I did a lot of work with the online courses that we had offered up until 2021. So firmly kind of rooted in the training and coaching education when, I started doing game stuff that was really more seasonal. The games at the time were really small. So they would come around kind of once a year. You'd shift gears, start focusing on that. And obviously over the years, as things have gotten more developed, you can't do everything and things kind of take on a life of their own. It's like, okay, you have to start deciding or have decided for you, like where do you spend most of your time? So if we fast forward all the way to 2021, that's when I moved to the games team full time. So that was the first time that I'd actually had a dedicated games full time role, despite the fact that I'd been heavily involved seasonally as we go through the other stages of the season up to that point. So yeah, been lucky enough to wear a lot of different hats.
Wow, that sounds like you've seen everything.
Well, I don't know about everything, but I've definitely, like I said, I've been lucky enough to be around for a long time now. So yeah,
Yeah, it's like 16 years, right?
yeah, it's kind of crazy to think about that, And
Are
I,
there any employees who are longer there than you
yeah,
are?
absolutely. There's a few. I mean, there's still plenty of people that I work with. Maybe not as regularly because they have jobs in different departments now and that sort of thing. But they've been around at least as long as I have, and there's a handful that have been around longer than me. So for sure.
So I'm a numbers guy. Do you know how many employees work for CrossFit HQ?
I don't. And it's a bit of a tricky question to answer because we have the core staff that runs operations and the day to day, but then we also have the extended staff of the seminar team and then the affiliate country managers, and so there's a lot of people that are within the orbit. But it depends on what your definition is of employees of CrossFit. It's it's a
But
moving
for
target.
sure, it's more than like 15 years ago.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely a lot more than it was 15 years ago. But probably smaller than most people think. I think the company is still a lot smaller at its core than most people probably consider it to be.
You've been a judge for 14 years, right? Or at least more than 10 years, right? You started in 2008.
Yep, 2008 was the first year, and I think that it's funny to say you've been a judge for that long because I mean it really didn't exist. That was something that we carved out, and that's something I think that is also uh, maybe less considered now that we're further along the track from newer people. And they shouldn't have to think about it, but it's still a relatively new thing. And certainly back then, we were developing it as it was happening. And so that's one of the things that I'm really happy about is over the years, like how to run a CrossFit competition. I mean, there's a lot of people involved, but I mean, I was really at the center of a lot of that and how to develop, competition protocols, like the modern CrossFit competition. Surely somebody else would have picked up the mantle, but I mean, man, my fingerprints are all over that.
Yeah, I mean, I've been around like for 10 years, so I know how it looked like 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And even if you go on YouTube and you check out like the first CrossFit Games on the ranch and you compare it to today, it's like a completely different thing,
Yeah.
right? Today it looks like ESPN, a big sports show, and it used to be like very, very small. And I feel like this whole transition is it's so cool.
Yeah, I agree. It's been fun to be a part of. I remember the first year in 2010 when we moved off the ranch, and we were at the time, I think it was called the Home Depot Center in LA. And, I think frankly, we were kind of out of our depth just a little bit. I don't think we were quite ready to make that transition. You look at some of those old videos and you're like, okay, like there weren't that many spectators there. I think it was a bit of a stretch, but it was necessary to kind of keep pushing it. But that year really was the turning point, in my opinion, because we had this really big, legitimate venue. It was the first time we'd been kind of out of our home turf, so to speak. And what we pulled off there, I mean, honestly, with the staff that we had, it shouldn't have happened. There were so many things that year that logistically you look back and you're like, how did this even come together? But we did, and it was really just a testament to the belief in the team, the passion around it, and people had the vision of like, yeah, this could really be something. So it's pretty amazing to be a part of something like that at that time.
So when you look like the last year has been a big change for you, right? Before you have been the head judge of the CrossFit Games, but last year you got even more responsibilities because you were in charge of the whole programming. And I'm not the only one who witnessed changes in the programming.
Sure.
Especially when I'm not a CrossFit Games athlete, right? But I still do the Open, and even the Open, they look different, they felt different. And how did that all started? Why did you get in charge of the CrossFit Games? What happened there?
Yeah, so in early 2022, Dave Castro got fired and removed from that position, and so the responsibility fell to me to do the programming for the season and to kind of step into more of a leadership role in that capacity. We've got Dave back now, which is great. So good to have him back in the seat as well, and we'll kind of share some of those responsibilities moving forward. But it was up to me at that point. Which was interesting because like so many things in the CrossFit world, there's not these hard divisions. And what I mean by that is, throughout the years, like I'd worked with Dave for 15 years up to that point, and I certainly had some input. And he would ask a group of us for feedback regularly when he was programming the games, and there was definitely a team of us that had input, and I was one of them. So in many ways, it was kind of a natural evolution. It's not at all how I'd hoped to get that kind of responsibility, but it wasn't something that was so foreign or outside of my skill set that it was a big shock. And as far as the change, it is kind of interesting. I think that anytime, and I think you can relate this back to affiliates and coaches, anytime you have somebody different who's putting together the program, you're going to have some differences in the way it feels and the way it's put together. My hope is that there was enough commonality that people still recognize it for what it was, and that it had enough ties back to kind of classic CrossFit that it's not so outside that it would have been a big shock. I mean, I think anybody doing it would have there would have been a change, and the athletes would have noticed that change, and people that were paying attention would have noticed that change. However, one of my big goals was that, it can be different. It can have my feel to it, but it's got to be tied back to classic CrossFit methodology that we all know.
I have to tell you, the burpee pull-up shuttle run workout was my all-time favorite one.
Really? Okay. I thought you were going to go the other way and say it was your all-time least favorite. That was a lot of people's response to that. But I'm glad to hear that.
I think that was the only workout where I saw myself like on the same level as some of the big guys when I saw how slow they got into the shuttle runs. And I was like, okay.
Yeah, on.
That's human, right?
Yep. You can see a little crack in the armor. just a little bit of daylight. Yeah.
What was your favorite
from this
workout
year?
which you programmed? Yeah, maybe the Open, maybe the Games last year. Was there a favorite one?
There was one actually from the Last Chance qualifier last year that I really liked. It was a row followed by a max handstand walk. It kind of flew under the radar because the Last Chance qualifier was, a more minor event for a lot of people anyway. And it was a really tight time cap. You had the row. I think it was I can't even remember now. But you only had like 90 seconds left when you got off the row to accumulate max handstand walks. So I really liked that one. Simple, it really pushed the pace. I thought that one came together really well. I actually really liked the repeat, which, shout out, that was a Dave workout. So the first one we did this year that we repeated from several years ago, that was fun. I like that big chipper style. I don't know. I really liked the twist on Elizabeth that we did at the games with the parallel bar dips and the traverses. I thought that was fun. And something, again, that is very old school. Like if you go back and watch some of the old videos of the original gym in Santa Cruz, you see parallel bar work. It's pretty prominent, and it's kind of fallen out of favor. So that was fun to bring that back. There's a lot of things that I feel pretty good about.
So many fun workouts and so many fun moments, but the CrossFit Games is only like the percentage of the percentage of the percentage of all the people who are doing CrossFit. And I still feel today that it's still hard to show the people that CrossFit is not only the CrossFit Games, but it's a lifestyle where you can just get better at life. How do you approach it as CrossFit, as the company, in order to make it more, I don't want to say mainstream, but in order to get closer to the people, to tell them that it's not only the sport for the big guys?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that's something that we're always going to be challenged with, because I think it's human nature to look at the top of the heap, so to speak, and be drawn to that to some degree. And it's a bit of a challenge sometimes to connect the dots back and say, hey, look, you might have a Matt Fraser who is just absolutely a machine, but you can relate to that, whether you believe it or not. And here's why. He's got some things that he wasn't good at. He worked on them, he got better, and now he's kind of integrated them into his whole person. You can do that too. Maybe the end state isn't the same, but the process is, and that's what's important. I think one of the really important pieces that CrossFit did very well, kind of in the last little bit of the 2010s, was we really started to tell stories of regular people in a really highly produced way. So if you go back and you look at some of the videos from 2017, 2018, 2019, there were some really, really cool stories in there about people that they were not in a good way, and they came into the CrossFit gym and they lost 100 pounds, or they got off all their medications, or they were able to reconnect with the community that added purpose and support in their life. And so I think a lot of those stories were really important to tell, and that's where I hope that we're kind of moving back towards is focusing back on some of those stories, because you're right. I think that's where the most powerful aspects of CrossFit lies, and that's where the most work is to be done. I mean, if you take somebody with an athletic background who maybe they play sports throughout their school career, and they play sports at university or college, that person's already fit. They already understand what that lifestyle can offer. Maybe adding 10 more pounds to their deadlift, it feels good, but it's not that profound because they already have so many of those benefits. Whereas you take somebody who's never been an athlete, you take somebody who, they work a white collar job or a desk job, and they don't consider themselves to be athletic. And you can get that person doing in their 30s or 40s something that they couldn't do when they were a teenager. That's really powerful. And I think that's where the bigger gap is for most CrossFit coaches. And honestly, I mean, having done both, I've been lucky to be immersed in the games, but I've done a lot of coaching in the past of just regular people. It is way more rewarding, in my opinion, to coach regular people to success than it is to take somebody who's already athletic, who's already disciplined, who's already hardworking, and to push them just a little bit further. And that's actually, in my opinion, a really good message to new coaches, because I think sometimes new coaches have this idea that the glamour is in coaching these high level athletes. Oh, I've really made it when I have a high level athlete. And you're like, yeah, maybe. But if I'm perfectly honest about it, that work to me is never as fun. It was never as important. It never was as fulfilling as taking, an accountant who hadn't done anything in 2 to 3 decades, and all of a sudden he's upside down for the first time, or he's never deadlifted, and now he's setting PRs and excited about that, and he's seeing these things that he couldn't do. He couldn't play tennis for a long time, and now he's back on the court. Something like that. I mean, that's really powerful. So, long-winded way of saying that. Yeah, I agree with you. I think the challenge is taking this really shiny, high-profile object that is the games and trying to translate that back into the really powerful stuff that the average person can experience.
So how do you approach the programming for an everyday athlete compared to the CrossFit Games programming? Because it has to be like completely different, right?
Yes. The short answer is yes. I think the longer answer is that they're still rooted in the same methodology. I guess in my mind, the separation kind of comes from, okay, if I have an athlete and they basically have dedicated their full-time job, so to speak, as to being an athlete, time is not so much of a factor. So that person, you really have to be less critical of what you choose to remove from the program. And in that way, I do feel it's almost, maybe not easier, that's not the right term, because it's certainly hard to program somebody into a championship, run. But you have a lot more latitude. I think the real skill for, again, a young coach, a young affiliate owner, is to be able to stand behind their programming that's reductive and says, okay, what can I remove? And what is the minimum effective dose that I can offer to my people that continues to improve them, with the understanding that I don't expect them to be there 3 hours a day. I don't expect them to be there twice a day. I don't expect them to be there maybe even the majority of the week. What I do expect is that they're going to show up 3 to 4 times for an hour. They're going to dedicate themselves to that short time, and they're going to see improvement. And that, to me, is the earmark of a really, really professional coach. When you don't have that luxury of time, you don't have that luxury of, it's just resource, really. And yet you can continue to make people better. And so I think the way to do that is to really sit down and focus on what moves the needle forward. And in my opinion, that's what CrossFit did in the early days. Was it took a look at the fitness landscape generally and said, all right, there are so many things out there that are claiming to help you and give the edge and whatever. What are the things that actually make a difference? And let's just focus on those and strip everything else away. And then let's codify that. And let's try to create a method around that. And that's how Greg landed on, functional movements, constantly varied, performed at a high level of intensity. And it's like that. It really does boil down to that. Everything else is just kind of noise, and everything else is kind of application. So again, kind of a rambly way of saying that I think when you're starting to look at the two different populations, the average person, you have to take a much more reductive approach. What can I get rid of and still move forward? It should never be a game, in my opinion, of I have to keep adding. I have to keep adding. Oh, now I need mobility work, and now I need some, supplemental work, and now I need this and that. And next thing you know, you've taken the average person and put them in a position where they have to train like an athlete that can dedicate all day to it. And that's not appropriate, in my opinion.
I don't know how you feel about it, but I see it all the time when people they start training in the CrossFit box and they train there for 3 or 6 months or sometimes a year, and they develop a level of fitness, and they learn all the movements, they get better, and then there's this tipping point where they feel like they have to train more because more is always better, right? So they they want to do more open gym, and they want to do what you just said, right? More mobility work, more strength work. Because I was one of them, right?
Sure.
I joined the classes, and then I thought, okay, the classes there are not good enough for me anymore. I need some more additional competitor work. How do you handle those guys?
That's a good question. And you know what I think is really cool about that is like there is a natural cycle, and maybe that's my it's funny to say, but like that's my old guy CrossFit talking now, is that I've been around long enough I can see those cycles, and they've always been there, right? And I think that's normal, where you get interested in something, it becomes your passion, it's what you want to do. Of course you want to do more of it. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that. I think what you have to just be careful of is convincing yourself that that's the only way to move forward. Those are different things. It's a different thing to say, hey, I love this, I want to do more of it. And I have to do more of it in order to get better. That's the only path forward. Those are not the same. So if somebody's just there and they're interested and they want to be in the gym, they love the culture, they love being there, hey, great. That's a good thing. You've done your job in that case, right? That's a good thing. But I think we all fall through that cycle at some point where you're convinced that, okay, I need more, I need more. And then I also think that given enough time, you come out the other end of that and you come back to the beginning and you say, oh, wait a minute, I can do the basics and still be just fine. And in some cases, I come out better because I've given myself time away from the gym. I can recover a little bit better. My head isn't always thinking about these things. I feel fresh when I come in. I can actually give a hard effort as opposed to just getting through a long session. So it depends on, there's some people that you just have to let them go through that cycle. And then there's other people that you have to take them aside and say, hey, look, like, what is it that you're really trying to do here? And if it's truly to develop yourself, there's other ways to do it than just more time. And one of my favorite things to do is to just challenge people on a personal level to find ways within the simple workout that's posted or that they're doing at their affiliate that challenges them personally. And so I'll give you a great example with a simple workout like Grace, 30 clean and jerks, 135, 95, or for you guys, it'd be what, 60, 40? How many
something
kilos?
Like that. I think it's very odd. It's 61 and 42.5 or something like that.
Close enough. But at any rate, for people that are really fit these days, that workout is like nothing, which is crazy. But okay, you take that and you say, all right, really fit person that doesn't believe that this is a good workout for you anymore. How do you approach this? And most of the time they'll say something like, well, I'm going to do fast doubles all the way through because that's how I can get the fastest time. Say, okay, cool. For today, I want you to do no less than sets of 10 when you do Grace. And they'll say, well, yeah, but it'll be a slower time. I'm like, great. I don't care. That's the challenge for you at this level, is to give yourself something harder than your best strategy to maximize the time. that's one way that you can sneak out a different response slightly from something that is what everybody else is doing. And it doesn't have to be a longer session. It doesn't have to be more work. It's just a slightly different approach that challenges that individual who's already at a high level. And there's many, many opportunities for that in most workouts that are posted. People don't want to do them because it's harder, and it takes a little bit more self-responsibility to stick to that sort of plan. And it takes a little bit of egolessness to accept the fact that, yeah, it's probably going to be slower than your best time, but it's better developmentally. And so again, that's another, I think, mark of a mature coach, and truly a coach that knows their athletes and their population, when you can go up to somebody in that class and say, hey, okay, Felix, I know you're a fit guy. This is the plan for you today. And, you might not think that that's the best plan, but I know where your weaknesses are. And trust me, this is going to help to smooth some of those out.
Yeah, I like that approach, and I use it all the time,
Yeah.
and it drives people crazy because they don't want to do it.
They just want to be there more.
Yeah, when you tell them, no, you have to take the heavy wall ball, they don't like it. They just don't like it.
Yep. Yeah, one of my favorite. I have this memory of doing a workout at a seminar, and it was rowing and overhead squats. I think doesn't really matter, but the weight wasn't that heavy. It was let's just call it 3 rounds of 500-meter row and 15 overhead squats. Let's just say that was the workout. And I think the weight was, like 40K. And this guy's like, wow, it's too light for me. I think I want to go up to 60. And I said, well, how about you just commit to holding a 140 on the 500s instead of increasing the weight? And he's like, well, I don't know, that I might have to break up the weightlifting in that case. I'm like, well, yeah, exactly. So, there's always ways that you can approach something that make it a little bit harder without having to add anything, without having to, complete another session, etc. So for the average person, you should be looking for those opportunities.
In a workout like that, the athlete's goal is, I want to go faster than last time. That's what I see all the time. The people want to be first on the leaderboard, and they don't really want to develop personally. They just want to be the best, the fastest. How do you talk to those people?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I think it is both. Rooted in the CrossFit methodology is that, can you measure it? Can you repeat it? That sort of thing. Can I take a look at what I've done in the past and compare it to what I've done today? Like that's a very powerful thing. And so, the basic tool of the time it takes to complete something is useful in that regard. Where I think most people aren't very nuanced about that is comparing apples to apples. And so again, okay, if I have my best ever grace time, to go back to that example, and my entire goal is to maximize that outcome, okay, then I'm going to choose the strategy that I want to do that. That's fine. But if I go back to my challenge to this hypothetically fit individual and say, okay, today it's sets of 10, it's not really fair to compare that to their best maximized strategy time, because they're different things at that point. It's a different outcome. What would be fair is to come back a couple weeks later and say, okay, let's try the sets of 10 approach and see if you've improved. Now we've got something that actually makes sense. And so, people need to kind of step back and not look at the clock as such an absolute thing. It's a tool like so many other tools, and it can have utility, but it can also be something that you get fixated on that maybe for the wrong reasons starts to drive you. So that's one thing. And then, one thing that I'll say, I kind of borrowed from jiu-jitsu. I do a lot of jiu-jitsu these days. And in the beginning, most people anyway, it's like you're always trying to win every training session, so to speak, right? And then sooner or later you figure out, you're like, wait a minute, this is training. It doesn't matter if I win. What matters is I'm developing things that I wasn't good at previously. And if the only goal is to win every training session, then I'm missing out on so many other developmental opportunities. I'm never truly going to get that much better because I'm just looking at one narrow application, and that's a bit of a shame. So translating that into the CrossFit world, I think, makes a lot of sense too, especially when people have a little bit more experience under their belt. You can say, hey, great, you've done the leaderboard thing. I'm glad that it's motivated you. Now we need to start maturing a little bit and have this conversation around, look, the time is one tool, but the goal of training is to get better. in many different domains. And sometimes the clock doesn't always reflect that. So we're not here to win. We're here to try to improve on things that maybe you're not so good at right now. And that's going to necessarily look not so good on the scorecard sometimes. And that's okay. That's part of it. And I think when you put it in those terms, sometimes people just haven't thought about it that way. And once they've been given permission to hey, look, it doesn't matter. We know you're at the top of the heap. We can see it every day. That's fine. Nobody's going to be surprised. Or put it another way, Felix comes in. He's always on the top of the leaderboard. One day he's not. It's not like everybody all of a sudden says, oh, Felix isn't fit. It's no, they know that there's something else going on there. It's just one of those things that most people kind of get hung up on sometimes. So yeah, a little coaching encouragement can go a long way.
Yeah, actually, that's a very, very good point, because it also translates to another thing that I want to talk to you about, which is the difference between movement standards when you look at competitions and the so-called points of performance when you look at movements, which they teach you in the CrossFit level 1, where you have certain points of performance which define a movement. And sometimes people get that wrong.
Yeah,
and I think
definitely.
It's maybe because of the same reason we talked about just yet, which is you have people who want to go fast, who want to beat their time. And at the same time, they don't really give a shit about the points of performance because they just want to go fast, right?
Yeah, it's a tricky thing because, number one, if you're looking at it from the long view, and this is something that you want to be doing not just this year, but next year and next decade and for the rest of your life, hopefully, at a certain point, you have to recognize that the best way to move quickly is to move efficiently and to move in a way that makes sense, that's not going to hurt you, that's going to actually allow you to maximize your output. And that takes time to develop. And it may look a little slower tomorrow, but over the long run, it will allow you to be fastest. That's hard to see at the outset. And again, that's one of the things that the coach is so important to kind of develop with the athlete. It's hey, it's okay to slow down and take a step back to ultimately take 4 or 5 steps forward. That's part of it. And again, I think that's another challenge of seeing competitive CrossFit being featured so prominently sometimes, is people look at that as a way to train. And you're no, these guys are competing. There's a fundamental difference. When the goal is winning, to go back to our earlier conversation, when I'm competing, it is the goal to win. And yeah, sometimes that means it's not always going to be pretty. And sometimes that means that I'm going to use a strategy that wouldn't be best in training, but is best now because it allows maximizing the leaderboard. That's a different fundamental activity. And so movement standards, they're really just there to give the best possible playing field to the athletes so that they know it's as fair as it could be when I'm looking at an athlete in lane 1 and an athlete in lane 10. That's it. It is not at all a recommendation on how to best train that movement to maximize the outcome. And I think people miss that sometimes. And they look at the way that certain competitions are structured and they take that back and they say, okay, that's the only way I'm going to train. Which is a shame in my opinion, because I think that the CrossFit world is so rich and there's so much depth to so many of these things that it can be really hard to express in competition because they're hard to standardize. That doesn't mean that they shouldn't be part of your training. That doesn't mean that there's not a lot of value there. It means they're hard to implement in competition. That's a different thing. And so if all you're looking at is the way things are expressed in competition, I think you're limiting a lot of what's there potentially. So I would encourage people to, not get too fixated on that. It's good to know what you're going to be approached with when you get to game day. If you're a competitor, of course, you should be prepared for that. But you shouldn't use that as license to only limit yourself to those things, because that's, in my opinion, not a great road to go down in the long run. And for the average person, who has no real competitive aspirations, it's even more important because it's hey, this doesn't matter to you at all. You know what I mean? It might appear that these people at the high level of the sport are the pinnacle of training, but really it's at that point, it doesn't apply to you. It doesn't matter, So yeah, people shouldn't get too wrapped up in that.
Yeah, and you see it all the time when you see someone like training versus competing, like not the elite, but the regular box member. And in the training environment, someone gets along with his shady technique, and all of a sudden you put a judge next to him,
Yeah.
and you have this movement standard. You see it all the time in the open,
Yeah.
right? When they change the handstand push-up standard from, you have to put your hands here, and now you have to put them there, and or the burpee step up, now it's allowed. No, you have to jump both feet over the bar. And then it's a perfect reflection from how you train. When you train only one way and you don't train efficiently, but you always go very fast and you don't really care about the movement, you fail on game day, right?
Yeah, it's much easier to fall apart because you don't have that resiliency, right? Yeah. And again, I think if you go back to kind of the core of what CrossFit is, that's a big part of it, is being adaptable, not really worrying about some of these finer details. And yeah, of course, in a competition, it needs to be clear to the athletes so that they can perform and everybody's on the same page. But again, it should be robust in training. You should be comfortable with many different approaches to these movements. And to go back again to the conversation we had earlier about how to approach programming and working out, excuse me, for the average person, it's like all the more reason that they should be exposed to many different variations of these, quote unquote, common movements. If you're somebody who's serious about CrossFit and you don't play around with strict pull-ups, weighted pull-ups, L pull-ups, kipping pull-ups, butterfly pull-ups, and you're not comfortable performing all of these different techniques, I would say that you're limited and that you're not really taking it seriously. There's plenty of ways to approach even the most basic movements in a way that may never show up in competition, but are certainly good for you developmentally. And from a even more, kind of longevity approach, they're going to keep you interested in coming back and offer challenges to you that help you stay motivated after you've mastered some of the basics. Once you get to the point that you're knocking off 50 butterfly pull-ups, I think it's easy to write off the pull-up as a movement because you're like, oh, I've got it. Whenever it shows up in competition, I don't have to worry about it. It's like, okay, cool. But when's the last time you did a weighted pull-up? When's the last time you did L pull-ups instead of, normal pull-ups? Something like that. People are like, wow, I don't have to because, I don't think it's going to show up in competition. It's like, man, that's such a shame. Yeah.
So I have a poster of fitness in 100 words, which is always a good reminder of that you have to play around with different stuff and that you have to focus on the basics and just trust the process. And I think when you go back to that on a regular basis, you're just fine.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the most fundamental things about CrossFit is it is reductive in the sense that, the idea is to try to cut away some of the things that aren't really necessary in the fitness world. A lot of kind of the bloat of the mainstream fitness industry. But at the same time, man, it's a really robust pool to draw from. And there really is a lifetime of work in there that can keep you interested forever if you're looking for it.
I feel like we could talk about programming and CrossFit for another 3 or 4 or 5 hours.
or how about 15 years? I mean, I'm working on that, right? So
yeah, it's your passion, it's my passion, and I always love to talk to people who share the same love of the sport. And it's such an honor to have you on the show today, and that I get the chance to talk with someone who is really a lot of experience on both sides, on the programming side, on the competition side, on the coaching side. And it was very, very nice of you that you joined me today in this discussion. And I would love to have you anytime soon back again on the mic.
Yeah. Hey, I really appreciate you reaching out. It's always fun to talk. And I would love to come back. I am looking at my calendar here above my desk. Next couple of weeks are going to be a little bit busy with the games and the lead up, but maybe sometime in the late summer we can try to reconnect.
Yeah, that's awesome. We can talk about the games then, and then let's see what happens.
Okay, yeah, that sounds great.
Awesome. Then Thumbs pressed that everything goes well with the CrossFit Games. I think there's a lot to do.
No, it'll be good. We're in a good place. We had a really good, productive week of meetings week before last. The team was all together, and we're sitting in a good place right now. So I'm very confident that this year is going to be great. And I'm looking forward to seeing what the athletes can bring to the test. It'll be good.
What's your best guess for this year's win?
Oh man, I don't know. It's such a toss-up in my opinion. I think especially on the women's side, it's going to be really hard to predict. I don't know. I think this is a year that we could definitely see a European woman on top of the podium. I'll say that much. I think it's a good chance.
Think Laura Hobart is looking very good, right?
I agree. Yeah, and Gabi Magawa is looking great too. I mean, she did so well at semis. But there's a couple of the younger North American women as well. Both of the Emmas, Emma Lawson and Emma Carey. They look phenomenal. So it'll be interesting. And on the men's side, I think who's going to be a maybe not a dark horse, because anybody who knows him and has followed him knows he's that good. But Jeff Adler looked incredible at the semifinals. So it'll be a fun race on both sides, I think.
Yeah, let's see what happens. I'm very excited, and let's talk to you soon.
Sounds good.
Have a great day, and see you next time.
Awesome. Thanks, man. Thanks again for having me.
If you like this episode, please leave us a rating on Apple or Spotify. See you next time.